Well, hello and welcome. My name is Tim Snellings. I'm the retired Development Services Director with Butte County, California. You've joined us for the California Wildfires Strategy for Planning and Mitigation class. This is a UC Davis Extension class, and it's all virtual this year. In this particular session, we're going to talk about planning and building more resilient counties. And there's really a series of strategies that are nationally recognized for how to do this. And we're going to walk through each of those 4 steps and see how they can help you plan better in your jurisdiction, city, county, hopefully. And this is going to help you be more prepared, more able to respond, and you'll be able to deal with the recovery process, which we'll get into in just a moment. So let's just start out with some of the sad story that many of us know that 9 out of 10 of California's most destructive fires occurred in the last 17 years. And if you think about this for a moment, you know, each of us might want to stop for a minute and ask the question, why? Why are we seeing these fires, such devastating fires, and new terms, firestorms and ember fires that are causing fires miles away and erupting into and engulfing complete towns and cities. So what's going on? What's some of the background causes? So is it climate change? Is it the fact that we are having drier winters, longer summers and falls? Humidity is certainly a factor. How about our fuel source, the trees? We have, 100 million dead and dying trees in California. So certainly we have a lot of fuels. The management of those fuels is an issue, I know, for probably another discussion. But the forest thinning process or projects to address that issue is certainly a factor. What else can be a factor? So how about the development, the way that cities and counties have developed in the urban as well as the wildland areas? So in the fire history, how does that relate to what we're talking about? So all of these factors really are contributors to the wildfire story of California specifically, and the tragedy that's followed from all of these factors and more. So we're going to discuss some of those. We're going to explore how to prepare, like I say, and as you can see, the cost of fires, according to the Forest Service, was $2.9 billion in California in 2017. So here's a list of the 10 most destructive fires in California. Most destructive in terms of the number of structures destroyed. And things to note are highlighted there for you. The Thomas Fire in December of 2017. Now, we used to think that by late October, certainly fire season was over. And that is not true. There really isn't much of a fire season anymore. It seems to be a fire year, a 12-month season. It could happen at any time, and we need to be ready. The other thing, as I mentioned, I'm from Butte County, where I worked for the last 15 years before I retired last December. And the Camp Fire happened, it started on November 8th in 2018. And we'd actually thought that we were through the fire season. I remember specifically thinking that we had made it, and until that fateful morning. But that fire destroyed over 18,000 structures, and we lost 85 lives. So these are these seriously destructive wildland fires. That was 153,000 acres. Okay, so Butte County, as I mentioned, is where I'm from, my most recent employer, about 70 miles north, a little bit east of Sacramento. And we have 5 cities, 4 cities and 1 town. Oroville's the county seat. Chico's the largest city. Biggs and Gridley down here in the southern part of the county, and the town of Paradise right in this area. 1,677 square miles, give you a sense of the size of the county. And okay, so let's talk about your current hand. And you know, as you think about your jurisdiction, think about these questions. Do you have any streets or communities with long dead-end roads? Certainly you do. These are fire traps. And some of these long dead-end roads go for miles. So that's something that you need to be aware of in your community. Are any of your communities full or forests full of dead and dying trees? Certainly the answer is yes. Have you experienced confusion during an emergency by public and law enforcement? The public is actually, they inundate 911 services during a fire, a wildland fire. And, our fire staff have reported, and 911 staff report that people call and say the fire is right next to my house, and they'll send an engine out, and they get out there and the fire is, a mile or more still away. And it's the fear and panic, and, there's perception issues. It could be dark. So there's a lot of issues going on in the chaos of an emergency. And then just the overwhelming nature of what can happen during an emergency. That is all also in play during a wildland fire. So specifically in this session, we're going to focus on planning and building more resilient counties and cities that interface with wildland urban interface areas. So, how can these fires happen? How does your county prepare for a firestorm? We talked about the fire season is really all year round, and how do fires start? So there's really 4 stages of preparing for emergencies at the jurisdiction level. The first is mitigation, and we'll go through each of these 4, some of them in a little bit more detail. This is the question, where, not only how to build, but where to build. This is land use planning, and then there are other plans that are in play as well. Preparedness, we'll talk about roles, responsibilities, as well as emergency operations plan. The response, notification, emergency operations center, we'll get into these as well. And then the recovery, which is the longest and most difficult phase of the fire response process. So this is a nice illustration. And if we start in the upper right here with prevention and mitigation, this is before the event. And so this is the actions that are taken to prepare a jurisdiction for wildfire event. And then we get into this next phase of the preparation, and then you have the event impact, and then the response and recovery. And then, as you can see, recovery kind of leads back into prevention. We'll talk about that as well. So mitigation, the goal is to reduce exposure to or probability or potential of potential loss from hazard events. Where and how to build. This gets into zoning and building code requirements for building in high fire danger areas. Mitigation can also involve educating businesses and the public on simple measures they can take, to reduce loss and injury. We'll talk about things like event covers to minimize embers being drawn into attics, defensible space, things like that. So speaking of defensible space, here's a great graphic that shows what happens when a home is prepared and does what it can to prevent embers from getting into the attic, providing green space around the house, keeping the house protected from essentially embers and a lot of space to break a fire. So from a land use planning perspective, we have the general plan and the health and safety element, land use and action plans. We have climate action plan and adaptation strategies. We have a zoning ordinance and subdivision ordinance. We have the local hazard mitigation plan, emergency operations plan, fire safe councils, and communication strategies. I'm going to walk through each of these briefly. So mitigation from a general plan perspective, each general plan in its health and safety element will have a graphic similar to this, which will show the moderate, if you look down here at the table, the moderate, the high, the very high, and the federal responsibility areas. So these are the danger fire hazard severity zones. So you might think differently how you build and how you plan in an area such as the high fire, high hazard, very high hazard severity zone. And that's different than down in the valley. This is the valley of Butte County. This is farmland primarily. This is the grazing lands and foothills. and then you get up into the higher elevations. And this is a common strata of elevations in many counties along Highway 49 and Highway 70 in Northern California. So general plan, general plan in each jurisdiction certainly will have goals and policies that will focus on fire and wildfire issues, to reduce risks, to consider fire hazards in all land use decisions, zoning decisions, environmental review, subdivisions review, the provision of public services. New development projects have to meet current standards. And so you're going to have a whole set of standards that have to be met for new project development. In the State Board of Forestry designated state responsibility areas, I'll show you that in a moment. The state has the fiscal responsibility for preventing and suppressing wildland fires. So this is something they use Public Resources Code 4290, 4291, and our panel will talk about this as well. If you're able to see this video before we have our panel discussion with one of our fire chiefs, fire captains. So here is in Butte County as an example, the valley. This is a local response area. And this green area in Butte County, this is all state responsibility area. So this is a significant exposure of firefighting services and resources to the state CAL FIRE, which is contracted service in Butte County as well for fire service. But that's another discussion point. Okay, so climate action plan and adaptation strategy, that's another place where you might have policies and actions that will impact how you are going to develop plans and programs for responding or preparing to respond or trying to mitigate fires from happening and spreading. So we'll want to see if the jurisdiction has a climate action plan. There's a lot more state requirements to move into dealing with adaptation and resilience planning. And so that's something that also can be utilized as a tool to coordinate with other plans, community wildfire, CWPP, community wildfire protection plan, wildfire mitigation action plans, local hazard mitigation plans. So we'll talk about that more in a moment. There'll be actions also in a climate action plan. And so you want to take a look at those. Basically another pass at looking at vulnerabilities in your jurisdiction. So that's another important point. Zoning ordinance and subdivision ordinance. These are where standards are set for new development, both for existing parcels and for newly created parcels. Important part that we ought to all be considering in our zoning ordinances are setbacks. And when we think about property line setbacks for how that relates to defensible space. In small parcels, it's impossible to get 100-foot clearance around a house in the more semi-urban areas. So that's something we need to take a look at. But in the rural areas, we got to be keeping our properties so they can, create defensible space around structures. And like I mentioned before, references to 4290, 4291. Also this is a really important part of the coordination in new development process, building permit process for reviewing with your local fire agency that has responsibility for the area where the development is going to be occurring. They'll address things like fire lanes, driveway standards, and then a significant important issue is secondary access for new subdivisions, as well as length of cul-de-sacs. How long is a cul-de-sac allowed in your county, your city? Because those are dead-end roads. Those become, if there's only one way in, one way out, that is a serious public safety issue. Needs to be addressed, and fire staff are ready to address that if they're asked. So next item is the local hazard mitigation plan. And I know that FEMA is working on getting these approved in most every county in the country, really, where there's where there are hazards, and there's hazards essentially in every county. So hazard mitigation planning is a process through which hazards that threaten communities are identified, likely impacts determined, mitigation goals set, and appropriate mitigation strategies determined, prioritized, and implemented. Wildfire is one of these hazards. And in order, couple key points here is that, first of all, there are grants to write local hazard mitigation plans through FEMA, coordination with Cal OES. And that's something, if your county doesn't have one, you ought to pursue getting one, because it makes it a clear-cut process for being eligible for federal disaster assistance. Is one of the keys is to have a locally adopted local hazard mitigation plan. And when the LHMP, the local hazard mitigation plan, is updated, the county's safety element of the general plan must also be updated to remain consistent. That was something we were asked about during the recovery phase of the campfire. Is our safety element in our LHMP consistent? And they were. And we did a great thing when we updated them in 2019. Both the local hazard mitigation plan and the amendments that were necessary to make the general plan safety element consistent with the new LHMP. We coordinated that process and actually had them both adopted at the same board meeting. So there was no doubt that they were consistent with each other. So that's something I would encourage jurisdictions to think about. There's also the emergency operations plan. This establishes the emergency management organization required to mitigate any significant emergency or disaster affecting, Butte County operational area, in my case, our case. So this is key to identifying roles and responsibilities required to protect health and safety of residents, and establishes operation protocols associated with field response to emergencies, the Emergency Operations Center, and the recovery process. We'll talk more about that in the next phase. Fire safe councils, each county seems to have different partners that they work with. It might be RCD in some jurisdictions, it might resource conservation districts, it might be FireWise, it might be fire safe councils. And in Butte County, we work with fire safe councils, and they provide wildland fire mitigation recovery services to communities. Forest reforestation, they do forest thinning projects in a lot of areas through grants, and they work with us. We've been coordinating their environmental review for the projects. And that's an area that has some potential for streamlining in the future, hopefully. I know CAL FIRE was working on that to do some streamlining. I think they were challenged recently. So at this point, I think we're still on for individual environmental review of forest thinning projects. Chipper programs, as well as education. So, but get to know your partners is the point of this slide. Communication strategies, there's a variety of communication and evacuation strategies. Code Red is a high-speed mass notification system via text, email, landline, cell phone, social media, mobile app push. That's becoming more and more common in jurisdictions. Phone, TV, radio certainly will always be a part of this story in responding to emergencies. It's hard to get information during an emergency. And the way to help that process flow smoother is to develop the workflow, the process flow before the actual emergency happens, so that the county has good media contacts. They tend to change frequently, and so it's important to keep that list current so you can get the word out and push, and that they know how to get information off your website, or what is going to be the source of information for an emergency incident. I know during our large fires, and I've seen this throughout other counties in California, certainly in the Carr Fire, Shasta, in Sonoma County, the Tubbs Fire, the recovery and response, as well as with the Camp Fire, we developed individual websites for the information flow process, because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion, and there needs to be the one reliable source. And the county is the generator of that information through its Emergency Operations Center, and then through the Disaster Recovery Operations Center. So that's key to make that clear before an emergency. And that gets you to internet resources and social media sites as well. Then there's preparedness. So this is phase 2. Preparedness is where you have mitigation that can only get you so far. Jurisdictions must be ready to face emergency threats that have not or cannot be mitigated away. So you can plan, prepare. You do your evacuation practice drills. You educate the community. You do fire forest thinning projects. You coordinate with fire safe councils on that. And stuff still happens though. Emergencies still do happen. We can't mitigate away everything. So when it happens, there is a process to respond. And so this process is outlined in this phase of preparedness, which is the emergency operations plan. And a couple of things are important here. This is where authorities and responsibilities for emergency actions are taken, assigned. Everybody needs to know what their role is. And it's important that planning departments, building departments understand their roles. Certainly building gets involved with damage assessments after the fire is out, working with CAL FIRE to identify the number of structures damaged and destroyed. Planning gets involved with the Emergency Operations Center, usually on a plans and intel phase role. But any county staff can be called in at any time to work an emergency. That's in the California code. And so people need to be ready that they need to be potentially available to be called in to work in an emergency, especially as some of these emergencies have gone on for weeks. You can't just run an emergency operations center with one level of staff. You need backfill, and potentially, you need mutual aid from other counties and even other states, as we saw with the Camp Fire. So it's key that there are tests and drills and exercises, though. And we did run some tests and drills, and those were extremely helpful, actually. For a little background related to the Camp Fire, people want to criticize Paradise for not being prepared. Well, Paradise was actually very prepared for the kinds of fires that it had seen in its history. And in the 2008 fire, which came close to impacting Paradise, it came from the easterly direction heading west towards Paradise, but it stopped at the Feather River Canyon. And that fire taught folks in Paradise that they need to have a better evacuation plan than they had. And so the community worked very diligently to develop a new evacuation strategy based on a zone map. Everybody knew which zone they were in, and zones would be triggered so that there wasn't a mass evacuation that clogged the roads and stopped traffic. The problem was when the Camp Fire hit, it was 100 times worse than anybody had planned for. And so in a situation like that, it was essentially all hands were on deck, and everybody did need to evacuate at once. And so you can plan is the point, but when it happens, when an incident happens, you need to be ready to adapt and have skilled professionals, on the front lines in the incident command center, in the area responding to the fire. The Camp Fire we thought was a fire response at first, and it was, but quickly it grew and got away from any ability to fight the fire, and it became a rescue mission for all the people in the potentially impacted area. So plan, do your drills, and realize that emergency management, this is one of these things that people don't have time for until after an event happens, asking the question of why didn't we plan? Why didn't we test our systems? Why didn't we run some drills? And don't wait till after an incident. You need to have somebody who owns this in the county, in the city, that's an emergency response leader that has that as one of their roles. And if not as part of a department, or it is a department in several of the larger jurisdictions. So the emergency operations plan, it is a living document that outlines the types of emergencies and disasters that may affect the county. It establishes, like I say, the organizational structure and the roles, responsibilities. Are you aware of the status of your emergency operations plan? Have you read it? Do you know what your role is? Do you know where you fit in the organizational structure? The other thing that's important is the national and statewide training opportunities. Again, this is one of those things, it seems like we don't have time for planning and training for emergency response functions. And there's the California Standardized Emergency Management System, SEMS, and the National Incident Management System, NIMS. And there's a variety of training that really you should be taking in advance of working in an emergency operations center. And the emergency operation plan is at a local level is an extension of the state's emergency plan. So it must be reviewed and tested periodically and revised as necessary to meet conditions. So the SEMS and NIMS training is available to counties online. So it's something that you would work through your emergency management office coordinator and get set up to take that training. And that's pretty important that you do that and that you renew your training. It's not just a one and done type thing. It's something you need to do and renew each year. This is an example of what the EOC field command function gets replaced with coordinates rather than commands, response operations. So the 5 essential functions of SEMS, the statewide emergency management system, are the incident commander, which is, this is in the field. This is fire, putting out the fire incident command center, and coordinating and managing all those resources that happens in the field on scene at some designated safe location. In the emergency operations center, that's where the management happens in support of, of the incident. So this is something that, and you'll see these sub areas, and there's an operations, planning, logistics, finance. We tend to work in the logistics section quite a bit because we have a lot of awareness of how the county is laid out. And so that's where we tend to find our role a lot. But this is something, know where you're assigned, know who's assigned, know do you have backup as well. This is a very small and difficult thing to read, but again, this is each department. You can see here development services in the planning and intel section. That's where we're designated, and plans and intel, situation status, damage assessment. So that's where, at least in our plan, what our responsibility is to cover that in the EOC. So the fire's happening, what happens in the county? So the response is to follow your emergency operations plan. First responders do what they do. The emergency operations center, again, get trained, get prepared. Don't make showing up at the EOC during an incident the first time you look at the plan. So what is the status of your local hazard mitigation plan? Have you read it? Do you know what the hazards are? Fire is only one of the hazards. We have earthquakes, we have floods, we have a whole host of other, potential fires, potential issues besides fires. So also, what is the status of your emergency operations plan? How old are these plans? And then is your general plan up to date for the safety element issues? And then is your staff trained in NIMS and SEMS, whoever is responsible? Do you have a funding source for that? How are you paying for that? Typically, it's a general fund type of cost. Roles should be clearly defined. If you have one of those spreadsheets, like I showed you, where development services roles are defined, you'd want to just be careful and clear to take a look at that. And then have you had emergency drills? You should know when the next one is and participate. So response, this is some pretty important steps here. One of the things that has to happen pretty quickly is that when there's a serious wildfire emergency happening, is that your county administrator, city manager, depending on where the fire is hitting, needs to proclaim a local emergency. The lead executive for the county or city would do that, followed by the city council or board of supervisors affirming it. Once that's done, you can request the governor to proclaim a state emergency, and this launches mutual aid. From the fire perspective, they will get out in front of this and call for mutual aid very quickly. But it's key that this local emergency gets declared pretty quickly, and requesting the governor to proclaim a state emergency. So launching mutual aid, again, any county staff can be called in to help wherever needed. It's key that you track your time for potential cost recovery under the California Disaster Assistance Act if the governor does declare a state emergency. And there's a lot of high-tech tools. I would say just be be aware of what tools are potentially available for your use for responding to the disaster in the role that you're in. You know, one of the things that's seems to happen, you know, we had in the campfire, we had the cell phone service went down, our backup to the cell phone service cable went down. So communication, you can't always count on your, you know, cell phone communication to be working. So you have to think, you know, what are the options? What's the backup? What's the backup? Do you have handheld radios? You know, we went through an exercise of buying all new radios, locating some new towers to make us more ready. So this is a little graphic showing the process of local assistance centers, emergency major disaster prepared. These are all of the things that can follow and flow out of an incident. And you know, this is just a good thing. I'm not going to go through all of these right now. We'll talk more about them. These are things we can ask questions about, and I will go through them in another presentation though. Another important part in the response is the declaration of a local public health emergency by your health officer. This is critical to triggering Cal OES, Cal Recycle, and DTSC resources for hazard assessment and cleanup. When you have these large wildfires, firestorms, it is truly an all hands on deck. Public safety is job one. You know, it takes literally every resource you can muster to respond to some of these fires, and for evacuations, as well as for the longer phase of recovery. So there's another interesting part of this phase, the response. One of the things that happens once the fire is out is the damage assessment that's done by the building inspection staff coordinating with fire. And they will go through and document, you know, each of the properties damage. Is it a total loss? Is it a partial loss? And then this leads to a process. If you coordinate with Cal OES, Cal Recycle, and DTSC, and they agree for hazardous waste, hazard assessment, and then ultimately cleanup of the property. In Butte County, you know, we lost over 18,000 structures during the Camp Fire, and we coordinated, worked with Cal OES on a program, and each jurisdiction will have to work with Cal OES, and they will dedicate an agency to work with that jurisdiction. I know in the Tubbs Fire, the federal agency was involved with their some of their cleanup of properties. We were fortunate, I think, in Butte County to have Cal OES, Cal Recycle, and DTSC helping for our cleanup. This turned out to be, you know, them coming in and managing this thing, this cleanup program with hundreds and hundreds of contractors working at one time. And, you know, there was a lot, you know, the contracts were issued for $1.7 billion just for the hazard assessment and the cleanup in Butte County from the Camp Fire. So this is a serious level of amount of money, as well as time that it took. It took about a year to clean up after the Camp Fire. So how do you track all this? In most fires, in looking around the state, most jurisdictions use spreadsheets. And we've tried that during our experience with 2017 fires. We had 5 different wildland fires in 2017. And we tried to use spreadsheets. The problem with spreadsheets is that people make copies of the spreadsheets, they take them in the field, they edit them, and you end up with different versions. So what we did with the Camp Fire, with having to manage 14,000 properties that were damaged, is that we used our permit system, our building permit software, and we added some custom fields, and those software were Trackit and Laserfish, and in coordination with environmental health to manage debris assessment and removal, so that we could clear properties and get them cleared and ready to go for rebuilding if people did want to rebuild. So we had a pretty slick process of managing the right of entry forms, which is something you'll get involved with to be able to allow the state contractors to come in and do their assessment and cleanup. You have to manage that process, or you have to have a separate process like we did also for having an alternative program that where someone could take it on their own and work with their insurance and their own contractor. All of that needs to get documented so that in the end you can identify where all the waste went, and that a property is certified and gets certified as clean before people go live back on that property and before we issue a building permit. So that's why it was great that we managed this in our building permit software. So the recovery, there's a lot of pressure after the fire is out, or even while the fire is still burning, it from the media, from the public that want to know, how many homes were lost, were there any lives that were lost, how many people are missing. There's an incredible demand for information, and fortunately, our law enforcement personnel is very competent and able to deal with those inquiries, and did a great job of responding to those inquiries. But there will be a kind of like a drive-by windshield survey, 0 to 12 hours. There's a safety assessment, looking at, like, Public Works goes out and looks at infrastructure. The utilities are out there. There comes a detailed damage assessment, and then following there's a quantitative assessment, and this goes on for weeks and weeks on these large fires. The recovery. So during the recovery, there's a lot going on. There's this kind of information on what happened. There's also gets set up a disaster recovery operations center. This is sort of when the emergency operations center shuts down, the incident is over, the fire's out. Now you transition to a recovery operations center. And this is county staff and fire staff, and could be other entities involved with this. There's a disaster recovery center. We set one of those up in our case in Chico at an old Sears building where we had probably 50 different agencies. And this was great to get everybody all under one roof and be able to process people through FEMA's process. There were a lot of nonprofit agencies there to provide assistance and services to people. There's just such tremendous demand when people lose everything. And in our case, we had 50,000 people were impacted by this fire, and losing 14,000 homes was a significant number of people that were impacted through the Camp Fire. So setting up disaster recovery centers, great coordination with FEMA, Cal OES. I can tell you that I'm so proud of how federal government, state government, local government work together during an emergency and a recovery operation. We saw first-class operation and coordination with FEMA, and really happy to work with them. They're very professional. Cal OES was on top of it. They did a great job. So work those relationships, get to know people at FEMA, who your FEMA coordinator is in your area in advance would be even better than during a disaster. A local assistance center, again, this is something that gets set up pretty quickly, kind of a smaller scale with state and local services. Might have the post office there, also might have Department of Motor Vehicles. People may have lost their license, they may have lost their mortgage information, their homeowner's insurance might have gotten burned up, their policy. So there's a lot of resources and agencies that come together to provide assistance. Local Assistance Center. There's also a Fire Assistance Center that was during the rebuild. We had them actually locate in our inside our department building. Fortunately, we had scanned previous years over 2 million building permit documents. So all of our paper files were digital, and it was pretty handy to be able to flip the switch and make these documents available to the public post-fire. We had lost about 4,000 homes in the county, and Paradise lost about 10,000 in their town. So we were able to flip a switch and make our records available, whatever we had. We had scanned plans. So we had building plans that was helpful, I think, to property owners and insurance companies. So FEMA housing also is another issue of where's FEMA housing going to be located. That's a whole big coordination process. FEMA is looking to locate people for housing for 1 to 2 years. And that takes a lot of coordination. Where is the infrastructure that can allow this? Is it in the city? Is it in the county? Can you use properties that had approved subdivisions, maybe that are already entitled? We looked at all sorts of different places. In the end, that was basically located inside of cities' jurisdictions where there was infrastructure. But that's a key thing. You might want to think about that in advance. If you had to provide housing for, 1,000 to 2,000 families, where would you do that in your county? So here's some photos of fire, post-fire. You can see we had some marijuana growing on this property, some drums. This was a manufactured home. Again, you find all sorts of things. All this ash, though, is presumed hazardous. Wells, you have to be careful about where wells and septic systems, septic tanks are that are damaged from fires if you're in rural areas. How do you protect the groundwater? These wells need to get cleaned up around them and capped or destroyed properly. Again, in a manufactured home. So bottom line is we go through this process of prevention, mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. And after it's all over, you do a debrief. What'd you learn at the end of the recovery? What'd you learn? What went well? What went poorly? And what can you do to fix and strengthen your preparation for the next event? And then, like I say, you go back and start over. Then you start getting better and better each time. After each event, you learn, you improve, and you do better next time. So that's really what I wanted to cover in this section about the strategies for planning and mitigation, planning and building more resilient counties. And thank you for your attention. We'll be talking about this during our class. We'll have a little introductory session that we're going to talk about this at before we get to our panel. So hopefully you found this interesting, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.